Okay, this should be it. Hey, Rich, sorry, I'm dealing with technical issues. I think that should be it. I sent you the chat, the thing. Okay, that should be the Makar for everybody. Um, I know there's a board meeting going on simultaneously, right?
On a different Zoom channel, so don't worry. But I'm going to make you the co-host because I'm going to be going back and forth. And
Okay.
I also started recording.
Okay, terrific. Okay, so the topic this week is faith and fear. I want to give three backgrounds for what we're going to do, and then we'll see how they play out. One is to address that question religiously, right? Are you supposed to be? Is like your attitude supposed to be gam ke'elech b'geit salmavet lo irara, right? Even though I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, I have no fear. So maybe fear is a fundamental religious failure to experience fear. That's one idea to think about, maybe right or not. Second thing to think about, of course, is a parallel idea, right, which is Franklin Roosevelt's notion that the only thing to fear is fear itself. Right? Do we think that's true? Why would that be true? Why would that be true if it is, or would it not be true if it isn't? And the third is that Socrates, in both in the Republic and in a dialogue called the Laches, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, discusses the concept of courage and the question of whether courage involves a lack of fear, or courage involves overcoming fear, or courage involves knowing what to fear. All right, so we should think about that framing as well. Is the absence of fear courage, or is courage facing something that could legitimately be a source of fear and either not being afraid or not allowing that fear to paralyze you and enable you nonetheless to make judgments about what sorts of things are worth risk? Right? That's we could try and figure out whether fear is a natural concomitant of risk. Is it that certain people are inevitably afraid when when there's risk, or is it possible that if you understand the risks and you're making right, if you really understood the risks and you're putting everything in its proper proportion, then you won't be bothered because that's just right. That's just the choice that you're making. Okay, so we're going to start with the Radak. All right, the first source, the first source on the pasuk is in this, right, when Yaakov hears that Esav is coming towards him, so it says Vayira Yaakov me'od vayetzer lo. So the issue we're going to be addressing all the way through is what's the difference, if any, between Vayira and Vayetzer. Why is it that he's very afraid, Yira me'od, but not not very Vayetzer, if you think that's pshat? Right, what would be the difference between the Yer and Vayetzer? So the first position we'll take is Radak. And Radak says, and this is a position Radak takes often in his commentary. I think Dr. Mordechai Cohen of the Revel School wrote about this. Radak says, "Vayira Vayetzer, kefel ha'inyan b'milot shonot l'rov yirato." Okay, so Radak says that there is no difference between Vayira and Vayetzer. Right, and the whole right, it's kefel ha'inyan, right? Kefel ha'inyan means that it says the same thing twice. It conveys the same content. It says the same content twice. B'milim shonot, but in different words. L'rov yirato, because he was in fact very scared. Right, so it's just another kind of intensifier. Okay, so this is a position Radak takes all the way through in poetry, that he thinks that even though much of biblical poetry is constructed in parallel halves of sentences, and a notion that Tanakh is supposed to be hyper efficient seems to suggest, as the Malbim says, that you have to find a difference between each half. Professor Kugel says the same thing, but the Radak doesn't. The Radak thinks you can just say the same thing twice. Okay, so that's our baseline, right? Is do you think that's a plausible claim that Vayira Yaakov Ma'od Vayetzer lo is just an intensifier even of Vayira Ma'od? Okay, Bechor Shor. The link isn't working for you guys. Okay, I'm going to share screen then. My fault. Deborah's computer, I'm not so good at this, so we'll just put it on. Just do this, and I'll try and keep track of the chat anyway. Okay, so at this point, assuming everybody can see my screen. If you can't see my screen, you should tell me. Right, so Bechor Shor says the following: Vayira Yaakov me'od vayetzer lo, ki lo yadam ma la'asot, because he didn't know what to do. Because he said, right, Bechor Shor says, this is what Yaakov's thinking. If I knew that Esav were intending to do evil to me, then I would try and fight, or to run away, or to find a fortified place. But now, Shema inu ba el lichvodo, maybe Esav is only coming to honor me. V'im ivrach, and so Yaakov says, if I run away, yasim lo lev v'yir'elo derech sinah. So then I am going to provoke, right, by running away, by showing Esav that I believe that he has evil intentions towards me. I will in fact cause him to have evil intentions, right? He quotes a marvelous popular saying that anybody who runs away, there'll be lots of people to chase them. Okay. Yes. Okay. For some reason, I can't see the chat. So hold on. I'm going to stop sharing for a sec just so I can find out what that was. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So the right. So Bechor Shor says Yaakov's stuck, but if Esav really intends evil, right, then how am I supposed to stand up to him? He's got 400 men with him. So Yaakov. So Bechor Shor says Vayira is that Yaakov is afraid, and Vayetzer is that it's not just if he's were afraid, but he knew how to act, then he would overcome his fear. But he's afraid, and he can't do anything about it because he's in a situation where, right, or catch-22 or a bind or things like that. So the Bechor Shor, right, thinks the Vayetzer is a condition different than fear. Vayetzer is a condition of sort of frustration, right? Right, when you have fear and there's no way to overcome the fear because there's nothing whatsoever to do. All right, so I think it's a very interesting and sensitive psychological reading. Chizkuni thinks that no, we need to, right? Chizkuni starts raising the question of, but why should Yaakov be afraid of anything? Right, Yaakov's doing this because God told him to go back to his land. Right, God promised to care for him. So is it legitimate for Yaakov to be afraid? So Chizkuni says, he frames it in a very narrow way. He says, Im Tamar, right, since at the end of last week's parsha, right, Yaakov meets angels who are coming to guard him. Why is he afraid of Esav? He's got angels to protect him. So the Chizkuni has a very cool answer, right? He says that actually the angels that Yaakov saw were two camps, and they were really, right, and one of them was for him, but the other was for Esav. And if you take this in the idea generally, right, that Rashi puts out later, that when Yaakov is both alone and fighting later on, that he's actually having a wrestling match with Esav's angel. So Chizkuni says Yaakov doesn't know whether the angels are going to protect him, right? The angels are on the same standoff that he is, and therefore Yaakov still has a right to be afraid despite the angels. Okay, very nice. Decide if you want to put, right, there are angels in the story. There's no way to avoid the fact that Yaakov meets angels. There's the ambiguity because Yaakov sends malachim at the beginning of this week's parsha. Does that mean he sent real angels or he sent agents? That we don't know. So Chizkuni says all the psychology of Yaakov is built around the angels. He doesn't know whether the angels are for him or against him, or the angels are equally matched. Okay, Ibn Ezra takes the an approach which parallels Radak. He doesn't see anything difference between Vayira and Vayetzer necessarily. So this, I should point out, this Ibn Ezra, which is labeled as Perish Shlishi. So some of you may know that Ibn Ezra we always only had one commentary of Ibn Ezra in the standard Mikraot Gedolot. Then when the Torat Chaim Mikraot Gedolot from Masada Rav Kook came out, the one in block print, so then there were two commentaries of Ibn Ezra, the Perish Aruch and the Perish HaKatzar, the short and the long commentaries. He wrote commentaries on commission, and so somebody else commissioned the new commentary after the first one, so he wrote another one. But I found out this week on Ala Torah that that there's a third commentary by a student of Ibn Ezra, which only exists in fragments. One fragment was published by Maurice Friedlander in the early 20th century, late 19th century, and apparently Ala Torah has just found a manuscript that they're identifying as part of that as well. So this is a new thing, the Perish Shlishi of Ibn Ezra on Bereshis, the third commentary. Never saw it before, and he says something quite striking. He says, "Ki Yaakov Avinu lo hayag lo gvura bilibo." Yaakov Avinu did not have gevura, Now, Gevura is a hard word to translate. Literally, we would translate Gevura is manliness. Right, manliness in Greek becomes a virtue, and really, it refers to something I think resembling what we would call, what in English we tend to call courage now. Right, so Yaakov did not have Gevura, right? Because Gever is man, right? That's why Gevura is manliness, right? Which is what virtue is, because wir is man. Right, Yaakov didn't have this Gevura in his heart. Al kain pachad. Therefore he was right. Therefore he was afraid. Afal pishaya tekif bekoach. Even though he was strong, he was powerful. Ki yesh chalashu gibor belev, because there are people who are weak and nonetheless have gevura in their hearts. Ki ein hagvura rak belev, because gevura is a quality that is part of that belongs in the heart, right? It's or in the mind, and it's not a physical property. So people are weak, but nonetheless are giborim in their heart, because gibor is only heart. And there are powerful people with their hands and arms, but they have no gvura in their heart. Kiyarehu. Ibn Ezra says that it seems to me that lack of fear is virtuous, but Yaakov was, if one hesitates to say it, but this commentary seems to say Yaakov was a coward. He was afraid, even though he had no reason to be afraid because he had sufficient power. But even though he had sufficient power, Yaakov was afraid. So this is right. So Ibn Ezra takes, right. Radak starts off by saying that, right, that the verse is emphasizing how afraid Yaakov was, and then Bechor Shor says he's afraid in a way that is very human. He's afraid, he's frustrated because he has nothing to do, but maybe if he had something to do, he would be afraid. On the other hand, we often frame it as that fear is paralyzing, and if it hadn't been for fear, maybe he would have been able to make a decision. Chizkuni says that Yaakov has a basis for fear because because he can't really rely on God's, right? If God is sending angels the other way, so it's not a good thing when there might be angels against you, and that's the whole, right? So he's not sure which way God favors, and maybe that's his reason. And Ezra says, no, really there's no justification for Yaakov's fear. Yaakov's just afraid because he's afraid he can. All right, so the question I have to figure out is that maybe there are other ways of justifying Yaakov's fear, even if fear is ordinarily a vice as opposed to a virtue, and even if Yaakov is a deeply religious person. So I have to try and address that. That is what the Gemara says on Brachot Daf Dalam and Aleph. The Gemara says that Rabbi Yaakov already posed the following contradiction. Tiv b'nei anachi machush marticha b'chol asher telech. Is a pasuk which God says to Yaakov, look, I'm with you, and I'm going to guard you wherever you go. Yaakov mode, and then it says Yaakov is afraid. Isn't that a contradiction? Amar Shema Yigrom Hachet. So the answer is that Yaakov, even though God promised him, Yaakov is afraid that he has sinned in some way, or that he will sin in some way, which vacates God's promise. So that's a very challenging religious notion. If God promises you, in what sense should you be afraid? And the right reaction should be, we would think, to become virtuous, right? Do better deeds. What does fear help? Right. So this is a challenging notion, right? Why and to what is this just? Why is this just the kind of paralyzing fear that Bechor Shor is talking about? That in every situation in life, Yaakov's terrified because he thinks he may have sinned. So that doesn't sound like a very constructive situation. There is a pasuk which says Ashrei Adam Mefached Tamid, right? Blessed is the person, or fortunate is the person who is constantly afraid. But there's also another pasuk which criticizes the Jews for being constantly afraid, and even the pasuk which says "Blessed is he who is constantly afraid" is problematic because it's the pasuk the Gemara in Gittin quotes to talk about Rav Zechariah ben Avkulus, who is the one who in the Gemara in Gittin brings about the destruction of the temple by being afraid to it seems to issue a ruling that would enable the Jews to preserve themselves against the Roman libel. that they're refusing the emperor's sacrifices. So it's very problematic, the idea that really one should be in genuine fear, not fear of God, but in fear, right, the entire time. So I have to try to figure out, is there a way around this, right? Because we could just read all these as very, it was telling you that Yaakov had lots of good qualities, but courage wasn't one of them. I have to figure out if that really seems a plausible reading of Yaakov's character in light of the other stories. He does confront the shepherds. Um, whether it doesn't seem, Yaakov doesn't seem to be a coward. So that's right. So that's a hard reading. Okay, so the Medrash Lekach Tov says, and I'm not quoting the earliest source here. I tried to make the source sheet efficient by quoting the source which expressed the idea in the shortest possible fashion. So the Medrash Lekach Tov says it's not that Yaakov's constantly afraid; it's he has a specific reason to be afraid right now. Lama nid yareh? Why is Yaakov afraid? Lefish avar hamakom leveit el lo asaha isur. So when Yaakov is on his way towards Lavan, right, he has the dream which God appears at the top of the ladder, and he promises God, if you'll be with me, that when I come back to that place, I will, right, to Beit El, I will give you 1/10 of my goods, and he hasn't. So the Medrash Lekach says Yaakov has a really good reason to be afraid, because he himself said, he said to God, if you're with me, then when we get back to this point, I will do this, and he didn't do it. So that's a really good reason to be afraid. Yaakov has, right, he's not afraid generically. He's not anxious. He's guilty, right? He has guilt. The question, of course, is why doesn't he just give 10% of his stuff to God right now and solve the problem there? Maybe he thinks that would look like bribery. It wouldn't be appropriate. Also, the Medrash doesn't tell us why Yaakov didn't do it. So even if we absolve Yaakov of the charge of cowardice, we're creating a worse charge. Why is Yaakov not keeping his word? If he has a reason not to keep his word, so then why is he afraid? Okay, really interesting challenge. The Kli Yakar thinks that that's a bit of a stretch, so he finds a different sin that Yaakov's afraid. Yaakov thinks that he flattered Esav. He thinks that in this confrontation, because he flattered Esav, that's right. And he says, "Kol amar avdecha Yaakov," so says your servant Yaakov. So that itself is a sin. But this is kind of a circularity, because the reason he greeted Esav that way is because he was afraid. So Yaakov is feeling guilty because he was afraid. Now he's afraid because he acted out of, right? Because he acted out of fear. So this is just building on itself and doesn't really in any way excuse Yaakov. So this approach, right? This idea that that Yaakov, right? So the Kli Yakar says that Yaakov's initial fear causes him to make a mistake, which causes him to be now afraid that he's no longer virtuous because he committed a wrong act out of fear, and maybe that's a wrong act as well. So the Netziv and the Malbim each take, again, there are antecedents to this, and medieval antecedents. I just picked the ones who say it in the shortest and most interesting way. Netziv says that Vayira Yaakov Ma'od Vayetzer Lo means that Vayetzer means that he experienced distress, right? Not that it's not really an intensification of fear. Radak's not convincing that way. So the Netziv and the Malbim both say the Vayetzer Lo is that Yaakov experiences distress because he's afraid, and he thinks he shouldn't have been. Right? Well, Yaakov thinks he did wrong. Maybe that's even Shema Yigrom Ached. Yaakov thinks he did wrong by being afraid, and so now he's doubly afraid because of that. Because being afraid is wrong. So the Netziv says this is a very common thing. Vayetzer Lo, why is he in distress? He's in distress because he had the experience of fear. He knows that he shouldn't. So the Netziv says when you experience fear, that when you're not confident, that you treat that as an omen or as a cause. You're not likely to fight well when you're generally afraid. So that's Netziv's general sense that Yaakov is afraid, and he thinks that his fear, like as when you're afraid in battle, if you know the people around you are afraid, so then it's likely that you're going to break, and that's the most dangerous thing to do, at least in classical warfare, right? When you break the front, so then you lose all the advantages of a joint defense. So Yaakov thinks that he does not have the emotional wherewithal to withstand Esav, even though he has the strength. So his fear feeds on itself. The Malbim right, makes right as opposed to Netziv, who makes a pragmatic claim of this. The Malbim makes it explicitly a moral claim. Vayira Yaakov Meod, Hinei Abotech B'Hashem, Ein Lo Li Rab Mibasar Badam. People who trust in God, who have faith in God, have no reason to be afraid of human beings. Vayira Moreh, She'ein Bitchono Karoi. And the fact that they experience Yirah demonstrates that they do not have a proper faith. Okay, right? He quotes the pasuk. It says, "Mi'at vatiri me'enosh yamut." What are you doing, being afraid of a mortal human being? Vatishkach Hashem osecha, and you forget about God. If you really trust in God, then you should not be afraid at all. Bifrat, sheYaakov hayalo haftacha me'Hashem. Right, Yaakov, right, has a specific promise from God. He doesn't have to rely on generic religious faith. Lo hayalo lira, so he should not have been afraid. And then we get into right the actually fear leads to its own result. And Netziv gave a naturalistic way in which Netziv leads to its end result. But the Malbim says, Hashem eino oseh nes lamala miderech hateva. God does not perform miracles that go right beyond the natural order. Rak lemisha b'teach alav b'chol libo, except for people who have perfect faith. Ve'achar shera Yaakov shehu mityareh. So now Yaakov says, I'm afraid. L'chein vayitzer lo. So now he's in distress because he knows that if he had not been afraid, there would have been nothing to be afraid of. But now that he is afraid, there's a lot to be afraid of because now he's not worthy of miracles anymore. And that's why, says the Malbim, that's why Yaakov now starts engaging in preparation for warfare. He hasn't previously, because up until now, until he experiences fear, he assumes that God will take care of him. But now he knows that once he experiences fear, that God won't. Right? So the Malbim essentially says that the only thing really to fear is fear itself. Right? If you're not afraid, then nothing can happen to you. But once you're afraid, then all the other things that you're afraid of might happen, because God will no longer save you. And this is an idea that has roots in, it certainly has deep roots in traditional Jewish thought. I think the parallel that comes to mind immediately is the Ramban's position. The Ramban says that that medicine is a b'diavad, right? Really, people on the highest level would be able to faith heal. They would just pray to God and God would heal them. But he says, you know what? Most people, that only works if you have perfect faith. Since none of us have perfect faith, we should all go to doctors, because once you're not afraid, right, in the natural order, things are really dangerous. Okay, so what you have, right, is a whole set of really a whole set of commentaries that depict Yaakov as the virtue he has, perhaps, right? This goes back to one of the issues that everybody, right? Yitzchak represents Gvura and Yaakov represents Emet. There's a pasuk, right? Titain Emet liYaakov, and everybody has to figure out how can Yaakov be the representative of truth when Yaakov seems to engage in deception with his father, engages in, I guess, justifiable sharp practice with Lavan and his salary, and then it seems to also to lead to his children deceiving him about Yosef, deceiving him at Shechem. So how does Yaakov become Emet? So one possibility is that the common ground of all these interpretations is that Yaakov is honest about with himself. There's no self-deception. There's no failure to realize what he is. Yaakov is afraid, and he doesn't pretend to not be afraid. He's not unaware of not being afraid. He's afraid, and that fear gives him distress. And that fear may be just a lack of a particular kind of courage, as Ibn Ezra is reported to have said, or it may be guilt about specific sins. It may be a kind of paralysis which may feed on itself, right? So we don't. But Yaakov, nobody thinks that that Yaakov is unaware of the cause of his distress, right? I mean, nobody thinks that Yaakov experiences some kind of free-floating anxiety or dread. No, Yaakov is afraid, and he knows exactly what he's afraid of. Okay, these ideas, right? This notion that that Yaakov is afraid, and that fear is a religious vice, is really interesting expressed in Midrash Rabbah. So Midrash Rabbah begins by saying, "Vayira Yaakov Ma'od Vayitzer Lo." So Rav Pinchas B'Shem Reuven says there were two people that God gave them promises, and nonetheless they were afraid. And who are those two people? The Habachur Shebe'avot, the best, right, the chosen one among the forefathers, the Habachur Shebe'Neviim, and the chosen one among the prophets. Habachur Shebe'avot Ze Yaakov, right? Yaakov is the chosen one because there's a pasuk that says, Ki Yaakov Bachar Lo Ka, right? God chose Yaakov, and God said to him, Hinei Nochi Imach, I'm with you, and nonetheless he's afraid. And Moshe, right, is also a verse that describes Moshe specifically as Bechiro, the chosen of God. And God told him Ki Eyeh Imach when he asked how he can go to Paro. And in the end, Hashem says to Moshe, Al Tiraoto, don't be afraid. Eino Amar Al Tiraoto, Lemi Shnit Yarei, right? There's no reason to be, if you tell somebody don't be afraid, that means they're afraid. So we see that Moshe experiences fear. So this is an interesting notion. Like that, on the one hand, it seems like we're being critical of fear. And on the other hand, we're saying that while we're being critical of fear, there is nobody who doesn't experience it. Even the people, right? The greatest of the, right? He says the chosen. I don't know, but in context, I think that's supposed to mean something like the greatest, right? The greatest of the forefathers, the greatest of the prophets. They have specific promises, and yet they experience fear. So it seems like this is that the Medrash on the one hand is critical, but on the other hand, it's critical. What it says is this was a vice, but it's a vice that is inescapable humanly, because if Moshe Rabbeinu and Yaakov Avinu, with whom God appears to and says, I will be with you, are nonetheless afraid, so then you can't really hold anyone else accountable for being afraid. Right? Fear is something you have to live with, as opposed to something that you're supposed to eradicate. And that's, in fact, sort of Brachia and Rechobo and Rosh Nachman say that the Jews would have been destroyed. They were worthy of destruction in the time of Haman because they're all very afraid, except that what they say is, well, how can you blame us for being afraid? We're just like Yaakov. Right? So this matter is an interesting ambivalence, right? It imagines that perfection would be being unafraid, but perfection is unattainable. Okay, that's the end of the arc, which assumes that Yaakov should not have been afraid, but was afraid, either because it was a lack of character, or legitimately because really what his fear came from actual guilt. But whether fear is the best reaction to guilt is an open question, or Yaakov wasn't unusually afraid, which Radak seems to think. Right, he's very afraid, or did Sivan Malbim seem to think that his fear builds on itself? But Yaakov was human, and the point is just to say that Yaakov was human. And maybe, right, although this Medrash doesn't ever explain Vayetzer Lo, maybe what bothers Yaakov is not the consequentialist visions of Netziv and Malbim, that, oh, I'm afraid now I won't have a miracle, oh, I'm afraid now I won't be able to stand up in battle. But Yaakov, up till that point, thought he had perfect faith, and the experience of fear, because he's honest with himself, makes him realize, oh my goodness, right? That I'm as far from perfection as ever I was. Okay. Again, that's the interpretational line that assumes that Yaakov should not have been afraid, or that fear is a weakness or a vice, which is best overcome, although it can't necessarily be overcome. And maybe it can't be overcome if you sinned. Then right, you have to be afraid. But if you hadn't sinned, you wouldn't be afraid. So fear is a consequence of vice as opposed to being a vice itself. Okay, but now the Medrash reverses it, and here we get to what I think is one of my favorite lines in rabbinic literature. Medrash Vayira Yaakov Mod Vayislo Amar Yehuda Rabbi Loi Lohi Yira Velohi Tzara. Right? Don't think that Yira and Tzara refer to the same kind of experience. Ela Vayira Shelo Yaharog. What Yaakov was afraid because he thought he might kill. Right? So Yaakov's fear is not a fear for himself. It's a fear for, right? It's not a fear for his body. It's a fear for his soul. But Yetzer Lo Shelo Yehareg, and right, and he's distressed lest he be killed. Right. So there's this equivalence, right? That Yaakov has two kinds of fears. One is the fear that he'll kill. The other is the fear that he will be killed. I think is an amazing moral moment at the at sort of the paradigmatic conflict, Yaakov and Esav, in rabbinic literature, that we portray Yaakov, and I think that this is seen as a virtue. I don't think anyone criticizes Yaakov for this. We perceive Yaakov as being as tormented by the possibility of killing as of being killed. And in fact, in this midrash, we'll see that it gets reversed. But this midrash says, Vayira Yaakov, the first experience is he doesn't want to kill. And the secondary experience is that he not be killed. Okay, right? So he says, look, if I beat him, then right, if he beats me, he'll kill me. If I beat him, I'll kill him. Either way, this is a bad idea. Okay, then right, then there's a whole story about why Yaakov is afraid, because Esav actually has virtues, which is also a powerful thing, that at the moment that somebody is coming towards you, and so that your temptation might be to demonize them and to say they have no virtues at all. Instead, what Yaakov does is he looks for the virtues in his opponent and wonders whether maybe God should be on their side as opposed to his. So Esav has the virtue of having lived in Eretz Yisrael, while Yaakov lived in Chutz La'aretz. Esav has the virtue of having lived with his parents and honor, right, and fulfilled the mitzvah of honor and respecting them, whereas Yaakov had not. And it might be, right? Now the Medrash puts in that Esav said to himself, and somehow Yaakov perceived this, that Esav said, I'm going to kill Yaakov when Yitzchak is dead. So if Esav is coming towards him now, probably Yitzchak is dead, and that means that Yaakov will never get to fulfill Kibbut Avim. And so Esav has that virtue. Okay, so Rav Yehuda bar Simon says that Yaakov, that God tells Yaakov, don't worry, right? I told you, go back to Eretz Avotecha, right? Go back to your ancestral land, so that'll work, right? Don't worry, it's the land of your ancestors. So then Yaakov says, aha, but I made you promise, God, so to speak, right, that you'll guard me on this path until I get back to where I came from. And now I'm back home, so maybe your promise is invalid, right? So that's why God told him at the end of last week's parsha, Shuv l'eretz avotecha u'moladecha ve'ehyeh I'll be with you. So God has taken away Yaakov's reason for fear. Afal pikein vayira Yaakov mod, and Yaakov is still afraid. So why is he still afraid? Ella mikan she'ein haftacha l'tzadik b'olam hazeh. So the answer is that there are no promises to the righteous in this world. So this is right. So here we have in Midrash Rabbah, after the first approach, which thinks that Yaakov's fear is unjustified because for people who have faith there shouldn't be fear. Right here, the Midrash offers us two different reasons for fear. One reason for fear, all right, is moral fear, and moral fear is a virtue, not a vice, perhaps. And secondly, maybe the whole premise of the previous argument is wrong. And maybe divine promises should not prevent you from experiencing fear, but olam hazeh, because none of God's promises are perfect. And we quote a whole series of other people in which, right, where we go back to Moshe, and we put in David HaMelech, all of whom God promises, and they're still afraid. They're still afraid because lots of things can happen between now and then. So this is the radical opposite approach, that there are no religious promises. It's not that, right, and it's not a weakness if religious promises don't enable you to get rid of fear, because actually, religious promises are not intended to be unconditional. There's always a risk that something will go wrong, probably because of a lack of virtue. So that's a really interesting radical religious idea. We could respond to it by saying that just because there is no promise in this world, and they're very careful, there is aftacha tzadikim b'olam haba, presumably, that if you're virtuous, you will in fact get your reward, but you can't be sure that you'll get rewarded and protected in this world. So the reaction to that will be the Socratic reaction. So maybe what's wrong about fear is that you're worried about the wrong thing. Why should you care about olam hazeh at all? If you trust that God is just, so in the end, everything will work out. So that, I think, is a general religious challenge as to how you right, if you really believe that, right, if you really believe in olam haba and you think that olam haba is so much better than all of olam hazeh, so then why would you be afraid in Olam Hazeh, right? You would just at some point, take a Dumbledore approach, say, right, to the well-prepared soul. So then death is just another adventure, and not even an adventure because you know exactly where you're going. So I think this is a very challenging theological notion, but I think it should be aware, as opposed to thinking that no, really, the whole weight of Jewish tradition is that bitachon, true bitachon, would be the absence of fear. Actually, there is a tradition that says that true bitachon, not only there are positions that say true bitachon doesn't overcome human nature, and then there are positions that say no, true bitachon says nothing about Olam Hazeh, and Midrash is that we're not criticizing Yaakov for experiencing fear about Olam Hazeh. That fear about Olam Hazeh is a legitimate aspect of human nature. Okay, so now we're going to play off that the series of lines that assumes that Vayira Yaakov Me'od B'Yetzer Lo addresses the two sides of the equation. So the first thing to get right is that Rashi reverses the order. Right, the Medrash said Vayira Shema Yaharog. Right, he's afraid. But Yira refers to killing, and Vayetzer Lo Shema Yahareg, and distress refers to being killed. Rashi has the other way around. Vayira Shema Yahareg, Vayetzer Lo Yaharog et Achirim. That he thinks first about being killed and next about killing others. So that's a really interesting moral question. Which do we think is preferable going into battle? Should we be more worried about doing the wrong thing, about killing others? Maybe even if it's not wrong, you should worry about killing others. That was an article I thought about writing this week and didn't in the end. And I don't think we'll get to those Makarot, but if you look at the source sheet later, you'll see a fascinating discussion amongst the Mizrahi and the Maharal about whether one should experience spiritual trepidation even about violence or killing in justified self-defense. Okay, so that's Rashi reverses the order of the Midrash. Chatolas Yaakov Yosef, right, early right, I guess third generation Hasidic Rabbi, but like first says Vayirasha Mehereg. So he says Vayetzer, right, takes it right in classic Hasidic form. Vayetzer has to relate to the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Tov. Right. So and Hasidim generally, right, intensify the inwardness of the pasuk. So Yaakov is afraid Shema Yehareg al Yidei HaYetzer Hara v'Ta'avat HaChomer. He's afraid that he will be killed because he'll surrender to desire. Vayetzer Lo Shelo Yaharog et Acherem Hu Yetzer Hara. He's afraid that he won't kill his Yetzer Hara, or he's afraid lest he kills Yetzer Hara. Ki yoter tov she'achnia gam ha'Yetzer Hara b'kedusha. Because it's a failure to kill the Yetzer Hara as opposed to bend it to your will, right? To cause it to submit. Moshe Katavim Levan Garti, right? So Levan Garti, right? We interpret as saying, right? Garti becomes Taryag. That Yaakov kept all the mitzvot with Lavan, and he bent Lavan to his perhaps to his will. I have to see how Tol Yaakov Yosef interprets it. The underlying claim, Tol Yaakov Yosef, he makes it internal in Yaakov, but he's really making, I think, a generic claim that when confronted by an opponent, it's always a failure if you have to destroy them, as opposed to find some way to turn them to the good. So Vayira Yaakov Vayotzer Lo is Yaakov's afraid that he will surrender, and he's also afraid that the only way he'll be able to avoid surrender is by destroying the other, and that is a failure. It's a failure internally in terms of all your drives, and it's a failure externally in terms of your enemies. Okay, the Toldos Yitzchak right now, right, is not related to the Toldos Yaakov Yosef or even one generation earlier. The Toldos Yitzchak is a medieval work as opposed to Toldos Yaakov Yosef. It's Hasidic. So he quotes Rashi, and he says, "Vayomer b'harigato me'od." When Vayiras says very much, "Aval b'harigato et acherim lo arme me'od ki bar l'hargacha hashkem l'hargo." So he says, look, Rashi says that Vayira means lest you be killed, and Vayetzer Lo is lest you kill others, and the intensifier me'od only appears by the first. So obviously Rashi thinks that you're entitled to be more worried, more afraid of being killed than of killing, because after all, killing, that's justified. So there are a number of powerful things about this. One is that he seems to take that position that Yaakov is still distressed about killing, even about wholly justified killing. So this is a whole debate in the realm of like how we're supposed to relate to war, milchemet mitzvah, or if we're supposed to experience any guilt at all about the deaths of our enemies. So I have always argued yes. Some of my colleagues have argued no. I remember that a friend at Harvard Hill is now a prominent right-wing political figure. He said, and he's correct. He'd been in the army. I haven't. That you can't run an army with people being constantly afraid morally. On the other hand, I think that the alternative is equally dangerous. And had a really fun discussion for Torah in Motion some years ago about military ethics with Asa Kasher, who wrote the part of the Israeli military code, and a chief ethicist for the Canadian Army. I think that that's a really interesting way to balance it. This Holy Zichlik says that there is, even when it's justified, there still is guilt. But he says not as much guilt because it says Ma'od about Vayira, and which is talking about being killed, and not about killing others, which is Vayetzer. But now we remember that the Medrash had it reversed. The Medrash said Vayira was talking about killing others, and Vayetzer was talking about being killed. So that means that tells you that according to the Midrash, it's the other way around. Yaakov is more bothered by the prospect of killing than the prospect of being killed. So that I think is a really powerful notion. I will say, autobiographically, when I was leaving high school, and so I was considering what to do the next year. So when it was a little early it wasn't yet standard for everyone to go to Israel. Although what really we did was you went to you left high school after 3 years. You went to YU for college for your first year, and then at least in the top share, my share, I think 23 out of 25 guys went to Israel the next year. The question was where, and people offered all sorts of possibilities, but I was really, at that point, the only place I was interested in going possibly was Yeshivat Har Etzion. It was Gusht, it was Rav Lichtenstein. And at that point, Americans had to hold guns on guard duty, and I decided I really didn't want to hold a gun. I didn't want to be in a position where I might have to kill somebody. I didn't want to drive either at that point. I didn't get my license until I was 25. And then I really worried for a long time. That I said it was because I didn't want to kill people, but that maybe it was because I was afraid of being killed. And so it was actually a very liberating moment for me when, before the first Gulf War, I had a conference in America in the middle of the year. I was in Israel for the year, and I had a conference in America that right just before the deadline expired from that we were going to bomb Baghdad, and I could have stayed home. My parents offered me a vacation anywhere in the world I wanted for the duration of the war, and I said no, I really belong in Israel. So I went back. My parents bought me the ticket on the last flight back to Israel before the war, before they canceled flights, and I made it back. And that was very important to me to know that actually, no, the reason I didn't want to shoot people, it didn't mean that I was afraid of being in the right place and helping if I was supposed to be. So I think there's a really important thing in this midrash, and it's valuable to note that maybe we should be more afraid of killing than of being killed. On the other hand, it's not a universalizable principle. And I think that some years later, an American accidentally shot somebody while standing guard duty at Gush, and then they changed the rules so that Americans were not allowed to hold guns anymore, which I think was a much wiser move. Anyway, perhaps I would have gone had they changed that years earlier. Okay, the Be'er Mayim Chaim has a really complicated way around this. What he says is that, of course, Yaakov is not worried about killing people legitimately because you're allowed to do that. So there's no basis for guilt. What he says is, but here, and this is a strikingly modern thing. He says that what's going on here is that Esav creates the appearance of friendship, and Esav is trying to get Yaakov to attack him without Esav having appeared to engage in aggression. It's a really interesting move, right? You take a large army and you dress them up in tuxedos. And you say, we're all coming, right? We're coming as your honor guard. But you can't tell whether they're really coming as your honor guard or whether if you let them in, right, it's just a Trojan horse. So what Yaakov is afraid is that although he knows that Esav's intentions are evil, that if he attacks Esav, he's going to create a Chil Hashem, going to desecrate God's name, or we would say nowadays, bad PR. And that's right. So it's Yaakov. So according to the Be'er Mayim Chaim, this Hasidic commentary, Yaakov is facing this, classic modern issue of asymmetrical warfare. It was the enemy who doesn't declare themselves, and if you engage in self-defense, then you will be perceived as the aggressor in the world, and that's what Yaakov is really worried about. Okay, so that's right. A very modern notion doesn't tell us what Yaakov should do. Yaakov has a basis for being right. This is a fear. It's not a. It's a religious fear as opposed to a moral fear. He's not worried that he's killing people who don't deserve to be killed. That we'll perhaps see later. But he's worried that he will be perceived. And Kiddush and Chil Hashem are vital religious categories. So maybe you can't. Are you allowed to defend yourself at the cost of creating bad, the impression that you're a bad person, and everyone identifies you as a religious person, right? So that's a really difficult moral quandary, which is set up very classically here. And then he says it also, he loves his father, and his father is not going to believe that Esav had negative intentions. So not only will he be killing Esav and be thought evil in the eyes of the world, he's also hurting somebody whom he loves. So Be'er Mayim Chaim says Yaakov has a reason for his paralysis isn't being paralyzed by fear. It's a sort of legitimate moral paralysis. Now, of course, he assumes that Esav in fact has evil intentions, and that's one of the deep ambiguity in the text. That it's not at all clear whether Yaakov is right or not. You can read the text in a way where Esav never has any negative intentions at all, and everything here is in Yaakov's own mind. Aviva Zorenberg beautifully reads the Chama Leibowitz points this out already, right? When Yaakov wrestles with the man, it says Yaakov was left alone, and a man wrestled with him. So if he's alone, how can a man wrestle with him? So the solution is he must be an angel, but that's and you can externalize it. That's the way Rashi does it. It's the angel of Esav. But Chama Leibowitz and then Aviva Zorenberg building on that both say no, it must be an internal psychological battle with Yaakov. Yaakov has to vanquish the Esav within himself. Or you might say he has to vanquish the image he has of Esav. I don't know, that's not the way Aviva Zorenberg reads it, but I think it has a certain power before he can face Esav for real. But there's really never any battle with Esav at all. What Esav does is entirely determined by Yaakov. And how it could be that you could read it as, that Esav, which we saw, initially in the Rishonim, that Esav, as long as Yaakov doesn't walk in guilty, and then Esav will react with friendship, but he despises weakness. Right. So we can read it. Oh yeah. So there are lots of ways to read it in which Esav doesn't have these intentions. Okay. So but the interpretation that I really wanted to build towards, and I think is probably the way we'll have to end this year, is that of the Alshich. The Alshich is in Tzfat in the 16th century as part of the group around Yosef Kara and I believe, always terrible at history. And his commentary has been enormously popular over the years, but I don't get to quote it very often. I think I fail to appreciate it sufficiently. So I'm always glad of the opportunity when I get something that seems really powerful out of him. And I hope over the years I'll get to appreciate it more consistently. So here's what he says. He says, maybe the way to understand this is as follows. Yaakov has soul distress, lest he kill others. But he also has physical distress, right? That lest they kill him. These are two great things that can't really be justified. You can't fix them once you have them. Sarat HaNefesh, right? What's the fear of his soul? Because everything is in the hands of heaven but Yirat Shamayim. And you have to do the right thing, right? God does not control your choices. So so he's afraid that he's going to do the wrong thing. All right, so that's the right. That's the right. So right. So the question is now I have to figure out. So Shemei haroget acherim. Yaakov's afraid he's going to kill other people when that's the wrong thing. That's why it's the wrong thing. V'gam hasheni gdol lamod Shemei hareg. Now the Alshich is following the Midrash as opposed to Rashi, right? Because the first thing, the thing that really bothers Yaakov is the condition of his soul, lest he kill others. Because since everything's in the hands of heaven except Yirat Shemayim, he's responsible for his own actions. The second thing, which is also great, but probably not as great, is lest he be killed. V'hu. Liot haba'im l'ergo ba'alei b'chira. Since the people coming to kill him are free-willed people, right? They're possessors of choice. Ve'ein hu yitbarach me'akev b'yad ha'adam la'asot kol asher yizom la'asot. Right, and God does not prevent anyone from carrying out their designs. Because if God prevented people from carrying out their designs, there would be no free choice. If people would not have the capacity to carry out their designs, then reward and punishment would make no sense at all. Right? Therefore, God cannot prevent evil people from carrying out their designs, even against others. And he quotes Nebuchadnezzar talking to Hananiah and his Chavirav, and he says, right, who is the God who will save him? Who will save you from my hands? Right. Meaning the Rebbe says, right, God has to give me free will. If I have no capacity to harm you, so then my choices are meaningless. Right. I can decide I'm going to kill you, but I know that God's going to stop me. So in what sense is right? I don't really mean it. So God has to actually, right. So the only way that there can be reward and punishment is if God actually allows you to control your actions. Right. This is a right, the extreme counter position is the position of Rav Tzedek HaKohen Lublin, who says that Hakol b'dei Shemayim chutz miyirat Shemayim means that all your actions are controlled. The only thing you can control is whether you act in awareness. Right, Yirat Shemayim is in awareness that God determines all your actions, or under the illusion that you have freedom. Right, so the only right that I think is the radical counterposition, which I don't think is anything like the normative Jewish position, but it exists in the tradition, so and it's fun to quote. But the Alshich takes right position. No, that right there's no. Essentially, he says right there's no haftacha for tzaddikim in this world, not because there's a reason that God won't make unconditional promises because you'll always sin, but because the nature of the world is that God can't guarantee you against the wicked, because if God guaranteed you against the wicked, then the wicked would not have free will. So now he reads these psukim in Tehillim as an internal narrative in Yaakov's mind. Right, there's a game where B'cha Hashem chasiti. Right, I have faith in you, God. I'll never be be disappointed, be humiliated. With your tzedakah, palteni, rescue me. Ate elai aznecham mehira. Turn your ears to me rapidly. Right, so that the Alshich is going to pick up on this thing. Why rapidly? Hatzileni, and save me. Right, and be a fortress to a house. Right, a house of with strongholds to save me. So the Alshich is going to read this as a consecutive line. He says, Al Kenamar b'cha Hashem chasiti alevosha leolam. So what does leolam mean? Right, forever. So that's a clue. That must be talking about olam haba. Right, lo ba'olam hazeh v'asarat haguf. Not I won't be disappointed in this world or in the next world. Right, I won't. I have trust that I have trying to have trust that God will protect both my body and my soul. Achal sarat hachomer yarei shlo eskeh. But although I'm trying, I'm afraid that I won't actually merit having my body saved. Liotam balei bechira, because they have free will. L'chein b'torat tzedakah poteni. Right, so I ask you, God, anyway, to save me out of your not out of the normal way of the world, but out of tzedakah. Right, so somehow in tzedakah, God can save me this time, but it can't be a rule. I think, right, this is maybe a projection that if God always saves the righteous, so then the world goes away. But tzedakah is God, right? Is that God can sometimes bend the rules because it doesn't take away free will if God sometimes chooses to save people. But what about my killing? Right, that also scares me a great deal. Here he says, it's a fascinating claim. He says, now I'm asking you, God, about that, right? About my body. I asked you, please save me. I know you can't do it all the time, but this time you can do it and it won't mess up the, right? Would it destroy some, isn't that, right? Tevye says, right? Would it destroy some great eternal plan if I were a wealthy man, right? So David says, right, it will destroy a great eternal plan if you save me this time. But he says, what about the spiritual fear that I'm going to kill? He says, turn your ear to me rapidly and save me. Lest I don't build up the strength to withhold myself. If you wait too long to save me, right, says Yaakov, I won't be able to resist attacking first. But if you save me rapidly, God, so I have enough faith in myself that I can avoid attacking Esav briefly. So this to me is an amazing psychological reading of Yaakov is confronting this situation. He knows he might be killed, and he understands that he can't say, God, my virtues should always protect me from the wicked, because that would ruin the nature of the world. So he asks God, but this time, save me. And then Yaakov says, and you also can't prevent me from experiencing tests, right? Because if you always made sure that I never had to face real decisions, so then that would equally take away the whole purpose of the world. But I'm telling you that there's a point at which I'm not sure I can pass this test. That you can get in situations, right? And it's the reverse of what Bechor Shor said. Bechor Shor said that what causes Yaakov distress is the paralysis. He doesn't know what to do, and so he's frozen. The Alshich says, no, what causes Yaakov distress is his fear that he won't be able to remain frozen. This, if you want historical analogy, right? This is sort of going back to the 67 war, where everyone knows there's going to be a war, but whoever attacks first is going to be the aggressor, and so what you have to do is you have to wait till the other side attacks first, even though the other side has done all these things, closing the Straits of Tiran, that really are declarations of war. So Yaakov says, for whatever reason, whether it's because he thinks he would really be unjustified in killing Esav first, because Esav has choice, and until Esav attacks him, he has no right to attack first, or because he's worried about bad PR. So Yaakov says to God, I understand that what I have to do here is remain frozen. That's the right thing. But what I'm afraid of is that if I do the right thing, I might get killed, because it's the right thing to do, but the right thing to do doesn't help, because if the other side attacks first, because that gives them all sorts of advantages, right? And that you can read Michael Oren's book about the 67 war and see exactly how this calculation played out in Israel. And secondly, he says that I'm afraid that I won't be able to stop myself from attacking first. But I think I can do it for a little bit. All right, so it's a really, really fascinating read of, where Yaakov, again, his introspection in this reading is amazing. Like, he knows what he can do, what he can't do. It recognizes how hard it is to do nothing in the face of a threat. That's even if you know that's the right thing to do, but inaction can be as difficult to sustain as action. And then, right, so that's what Yaakov prays, and then we have to read on to find out if God in fact grants him the saving him right away, right? Whether because it doesn't happen until the next night, right? And really, I assume the way the Alshich reads this is that the fight Yaakov has with the angel is really about this, right? Is whether he's capable of restraining himself from attacking until he finds out whether Esav intends to attack him. And in the end, perhaps because he refrains from showing the first sign of animosity, Esav in fact acts in friendship towards him, and it turns out that neither of Yaakov's fears come true. he neither kills or is killed. Okay, that's the end of my share. And so now would be a great time if people have questions to ask them.
One thing in that last comment you made. So then when he's fighting the angel, I guess according to the Alshich then, when he's fighting the angel and Vayagav Kach Recho, so I guess it's the angel that touches Yaakov. I get right, that's how we understand it. So then and Yaakov is hurt. Is that the right? So he's waited, which like struggles with him but doesn't hurt him. Is that the impression that you get?
That's interesting. And I have not read through the Alshich on the Parsha, so I'm projecting. I don't know how he reads the injury of Yaakov, and I think it's probably unfair for me to speculate for him, right? Why it is that Yaakov gets hurt in the battle. I would be tempted to push it, and say that there's something about that, that there's something he loses in the process of waiting. Even though he gains the strength, right? He overcomes. If I were to put it all together, I would say he overcomes. It's the Esav in him that wants to attack first, right? It's that we're really, he projects onto Esav his own aggressive tendencies, and therefore he has to attack first. But you lose something about yourself also when you discipline yourself to inaction when you naturally are an active kind of person, and then he recovers at the end of it. So yeah, I think you could build the whole thing, but I don't want to blame it on Alshich because I haven't read it all the way through. So by all means, read the rest of Alshich and see what he says. Shkoyach. Okay, other questions?
I think it was the first parish they said, I don't remember who it was, but that Vayetzer was another word for fear.
Yeah, Radak.
Yeah, it seems like we have a lot of words for fear in Hebrew.
We do.
To me, like all the other Perushim are much, it just seems Vayetzer sounds like, something tsar, right? But it's not Pachad, it's not, I don't know.
Yeah, so this is right. So this is a general sensibility. I think that most of us who are trained to read rabbinically, we're trained to think that if you vary the word, it must be you vary the meaning. But Radak is comfortable saying, and he's not alone, that sometimes you vary the word because it's boring otherwise. And as opposed to trying to tease out, why this particularly precise connotation was here. This is why you said fear. That's why you said terror, anxiety, dread, distress. Right? Go through your thesaurus and make sure you use everyone exactly precisely. Radak says no. Right? It would be boring if you use the same word over and over again. And that's again, he does this all through biblical poetry, right? Which is all these parallel terms, and the Malbim each time tries to explain exactly what each of them says. We don't have Roger here, right? Give us all the examples. But this is a wholly different literary sensibility. It relates to part of it assumes that part of writing a holy book is that it has to have literary merit. It doesn't have literary merit, that it wouldn't be a holy book. So that's, I think, I'm much happier with what I think, with the approach which tries to find meaning. And in this case, I agree with you entirely. I think that Vayirav Yaakov Mod Vayetzer sounds like it's supposed to, but I think the more interesting question, which Radak relates to, is reading Vayetzer do you read Vayetzer as an intensifier of Vayira? It's worse. Do you read it as a consequence, the way the Netziv and Malbim do, right? Because Vayira, therefore Vayetzer, or do you read it as just parallel things, right? There are two different things going on. He's afraid, and he's Vayetzer. I agree with you that just to say, well, we need we could have said Me'od, but we said, right, that's really the question, right? Why didn't you just say Vayira Yaakov Me'od? Right? Why does he Yaakov Vayetzer lo, right? So the Radak would say, because that's at some point, right, very, very, very is inelegant. So he replaced it, right, with something else. I tend to agree with you. But I don't want to pretend that my sensibility is the traditional sensibility. It's a traditional sensibility, but you should be aware that Radak isn't bothered by the claim that nope, it just was more interesting to read that way. Great. Any other questions? All right. If not, then thank you again very much, everyone, for coming. I hope we'll get to
Thank
talk to
you.
everyone pretty soon. And Shabbat Shalom.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.